For over 200 years, Shakespearean scholars have questioned if the person named William Shakespeare of Stratford-on-Avon is the author of the body of English literature that bears his name. Most debate has centered around perceived incongruities between what is known of the man's personal history and the style and content of his written words. Suggested candidates include Francis Bacon, Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, the Earl of Derby, the Earl of Oxford, and Queen Elizabeth I. Today, Shakespearean scholars are divided primarily into two camps: the Stratfordians, who support Shakespeare himself as the author, and the Oxfordians, who support Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. A factor contributing to the authorship controversy is the lack of resemblance between surviving images of William Shakespeare, most notably a statue of him in Trinity Church at Stratford, and the engraving by Martin Droeshout in the first Folio edition published in 1623. If the images do represent more than one person, it should follow that one associated with Shakespeare's physical remains, the monument in Trinity Church, represents the man from Stratford. Conversely, the Droeshout engraving may well be linked with the actual author of that work. I have confined myself to an analysis of the images rather than the words of Shakespeare. In addition to the Stratford statue and the Droeshout engraving, there are other portraits labeled Shakespeare, including the Felton, Ashbourne, Flower, and Chandos. All, however, are considered by scholars as derivative or doubtful or spurious. The Felton portrait could have been originally painted at the beginning of the 17th century, but was heavily restored in the 19th. The Ashbourne is controversial even today. X-ray and infrared photographic analysis carried out in the 40s suggests the face is that of the Earl of Oxford. Some suggest the Flower portrait may have been the model for or painted from the Droeshout engraving. The painting at first glance does appear to resemble the Folio image. It certainly could not have been painted from life. In all likelihood, it was painted from a later version of the Folio image in which the mustache, eyebrows, and hair under the lip are markedly different from the Droeshout engraving. The Chandos Shakespeare, which can be traced back the furthest, is also connected to shadowy and contradictory traditions. It has sometimes been described as Shakespeare made up for the role of Shylock. A number of artists have been suggested as possible painters of the work, including Richard Burbage, the celebrated Shakespearean actor. Even though it has been retouched over the years, the Chandos remains one of the most popular of all the portraits, and even replaced the Droeshout engraving on 18th century publications of Shakespeare's works. Neither the Chandos nor the others are directly associated with Shakespeare's life, as is the monument at Trinity Church, or with the first publication of his work, as is the Droeshout engraving. The engraving technique has never been questioned, but reviews over the years have been mixed concerning the imagery. The artist Gainsborough claimed he never saw a stupider face. Others felt the image stood between us and the true Shakespeare. And in the Folio itself, Ben Jonson advised the reader to look for the face of Shakespeare not on his picture, but his book. The monument at Stratford was made by Gerhard Jansen and was certainly installed by the time the first Folio was published. The existing monument, however, may have been modified. Sir William Dugdale published a Folio edition of Shakespeare's work in 1656, in which he included an early engraving of the monument that differs strikingly from the artifact we know. Since the authenticity of the monument was already suspect, I turned to the question of whether a match exists between the engraving and portraits of Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. Two portraits were compared to the engraving: the Welbeck, a copy of the original work of the young Earl in his 20s, and the St. Albans, the Earl in later years. I flipped the Welbeck portrait about the vertical axis and scaled, realigned it in the same position as the Droeshout engraving in order to make this composite picture. Both pictures were bisected along vertical lines and the halves aligned at the point where the lips touch. The features lined up, but did not exhibit strong similarities except for the upper lips. The same procedure was applied to the St. Albans with no match. With insufficient evidence of a relationship between the Earl of Oxford and the folio image, I looked elsewhere for a possible match. The general search concentrated on portraits of people with known connections to the main figures of the story. Since some scholars have suggested the Ashbourne portrait was the Earl of Oxford, the Ashbourne was digitized, scaled, and flipped to test it with the Welbeck. The features did line up and demonstrated a match between the noses and an alignment of the eyes. While the match was not exact, there was enough resemblance to test the Ashbourne against the Droeshout engraving. The features did line up, but there was no match. Since some researchers have suggested that the Chandos portrait was the model for the first folio image, and since at first glance there seems to be a resemblance, these two images were also compared. They were scaled, overlaid. The contours of the faces showed very different outlines. The measurement between the inner canthi, the inner corners of the eye, of the Chandos was narrower than the distance on the Droeshout. A comparison was made between a portrait of Richard Burbage and the Droeshout engraving, on the premise that the image may have been a self-portrait of the actor-portrait painter. Again, while the position of the features aligned, there was no congruence. As part of the historical research that led to this work, I had occasion to look at a number of portraits from the Elizabethan period. The one that kept popping up and stood out because of the strength of its features was that of Queen Elizabeth I. Her connection to the theater as friend and patroness, including references listing her as a candidate for authorship, made it seem reasonable to include the Queen's image in the analysis. The Queen had a personal director in charge of her portraits. By 1563, the profusion of uncomplimentary images of the Queen had reached such proportions that she ordered all portraits destroyed or covered until corrected. The proclamation stated that official cartoons or patterns be distributed by her director only to painters, stainers, and engravers who had first been examined and licensed. From this collection of official portraits, I selected a number to compare with each other and with the Droeshout engraving. The Droeshout engraving and 4 portraits of the Queen were scanned, digitized, and scaled to the same size. All the portraits of the Queen demonstrated good matches between each other except for the lips, which varied from painting to painting. I compared each image with the folio image and found the same results throughout. When the left eye in the Droeshout engraving was positioned over Elizabeth's left eye in the Gower portrait, the 2 eyes exhibited a striking similarity except for the dark color of the folio image, a black and white engraving. The left eyes from both pictures were aligned from their outer edges to the centers of the pupils. The forehead in the folio image and the upper part of the nose to just above the nostril were positioned the same as Elizabeth's. The relative locations of the noses from the tops of the nostrils, the eyes, and the hint of shading along the nose and over and under the eyes matched. It was found that the distance between the inner canthi, or inner corners of the eyes, both for the folio image and Elizabeth I, were identical. The Droeshout engraving on the first folio edition, Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies, and the Queen Elizabeth I portrait by or after George Gower portray features of the same face.